Welcome everyone to this new tutorial, and in this tutorial you are going to learn whatever we can see on screen, right? It is very simple, but it is actually very cool to start to animate these kinds of shapes. So this is the final scene, and you can get this final scene when you join my Patreon, but what essentially is loads of these tubes and they get animated on these Bezier curves. So let's jump into a new blend file and we can start to create our main object, which is that tube. So delete this default cube and add a cylinder. The cylinder, we can kind of get rid of these caps, so do nothing, or you can delete them by hand. And now we can scale a bit down and then scale around the Z axis. So what you want to do now is you want first to apply the scale. So Ctrl A and apply scale. Next we want to add extra edge loops, because when we're gonna bend this all over, we need some more geometry. So Ctrl R, click on here, then right click, and you can put a number of cuts in here. And we can do around 100 of cuts. You can do more for even smooth result, but 100 is fine at this point. Now, when we zoom in, you can see that it is quite blocky. And with the right click and shade smooth, it gets nice and smooth, but the model itself is still very thin. So we're going to add a solidify modifier. Here you can choose a thickness. And right now you can see that it doesn't matter which thickness I choose, the shading still looks a little bit odd. And that is because we use the smooth shading. So if you use a bevel now and put this amount way lower, then put the segments up, you can see that now we also get some good shading in here. And with a subdivision surface added, it gets even better. So this is essentially our main model. But now we need to start thinking about the animation. So how do we animate this? We actually need another modifier for this, and this is called the curve modifier. This curve modifier needs to be all the way up in our modifier stack. And now we need to create a curve. So Shift A, and we're gonna create a Bezier curve. Let's scale this up and select our cylinder again. Then as curve object, it's gonna be this newly created Bezier curve. Right now it doesn't seem to work, but if you rotate the cylinder so it matches up with the curve, so rotate Y 90, you can see that now it follows this curve. If you move this now, the cylinder only, around the X-axis, you can see it follows the Bezier. What also is cool is if you just edit this Bezier curve, that the cylinder just follows. You can rotate it, add even extra edge loops here, and the cylinder will just follow. Next, we need to create some materials. The main inspiration of this material comes from this material from Chocofer, and I will leave his link in the description down below. So let's first go to shading. Then we can, of course, create a new material, but right now we don't want to be inside Eevee. We actually want to be inside cycles. So go to cycles and change the device to GPU as well. Also, if we go to the rendered viewport shading, you can see that there's not really that good of a lighting in here. And that is also a problem. So go to world and add an environment texture. Click on open, HDRI, and you can get this HDRI in the description down below. Also, I don't really want to see the background. You could put the transparency on, or you just create a new cube, scale it a bit up, and then delete these two vertices, and now we have some kind of studio. So let's go back to the material, and we need to start to create a glass-like material, right? It's actually kind of more plastic. So I would like to add a glass shader. And this is the glass shader. And you could add colors in here, or you can use an RGB node. Bam. And then you can choose colors in this color wheel. Very handy. You could also add two of these nodes and then mix them together with a mix RGB node. And this gives you just a little bit more control. So this one is maybe more towards the yellow. And then you can play around with this FAC value to change the color. Now, we have our glass material and it still looks a little bit darkish, right? So what I would like to do, I want it to look more like plastic instead of glass. So let's add a glossy shader, so glossy BSDF, a mix shader, mix these two together, and here we can see that even if I put the roughness of the glossy shader all the way to 0, it actually looks more like a metal now. And that is why we need to use some kind of Fresnel. And in our case, we're gonna use the layer weight node. And the Fresnel works with the index of refraction. You also have a Fresnel node by itself. So this really works with the IOR. And the layer weight, it works a little bit different. But it's kind of the same principles. Also, the phasing works kind of the same, but you can see it's a bit more extreme, a little bit more contrast. And we're going to use that in this case. And you can use just the phasing, but if you want to have more control over it, you can grab a RGB curves node and play around with this curve. These two here go into the back of the mix shader. And now you can see that we get some nice reflections on this outside. I do think my material is a little bit too dark, so for sure the RGB can go up in both ones here, and we have a nice bright material. So this is not totally it yet. What do we need to do more? Well, let's actually grab this studio and move it a bit up. And here you can see the shadow. I'm just going to use only one light, so I'm going to hide my light right now. And you can see that this shadow, does this. It's just dark, right? That is not really realistic. You would imagine if you have a colored glass or plastic, that some of that color will also be shown down here, right? Because the light is shining on it. So how do we kind of fake that, or how do we create that inside these shaders? Well, you're just gonna grab all of these. Let's move them a bit backwards. And I'm gonna add a transparent shader, okay? And to showcase what the transparent shader does, I'm gonna move this BSDF into this one instead of the glass shader. And let's change this color. We can just use the same color here, actually. You can see that now the reflection is way different than having just this glass, right? And we want this shadow. This shadow looks way cooler. And to only use the shadow, we are going to use the light path, grab a mix shader, and mix these two together. So now in this light path you have is shadow ray. So we are going to use the shadow only of the transparent shader. So you can see we now are using the glass shader as our model, but the shadow ray is from the transparent shader. And that is essentially it. There are a few extra steps which you could do. You could add another transparent shader. Move this a bit backwards more. Add this with an add shader. Here. Then we're gonna grab the same color, but we actually want to change this color a little bit. We want to change the hue. So hue and saturations goes in between here. I know it's getting kind of full right now. This is also not really necessary, okay? This just makes it pop a little bit more. And put the value to like 0.1. So this makes the material, I feel, pop a little bit more. And it was just also from Showcover, so I was like, interesting. And it actually works, so it looks quite cool. Now, one last thing, you could also add a volume absorption. So volume absorption in here. And with this volume absorption, you can see how dense you want it to be, right? So it depends a little bit on yourself what you want to achieve here. But yeah, that is volume absorption. And that is the whole material that we are going to use, okay? So now that you have the material, we can start to think about the scene. So with the scene, I just want to go to the front view, which is 1. So go 1. And then we're gonna select our camera, go to View, Align Active Camera to View. So now the camera snaps towards your view. For some reason, it doesn't work perfectly, so you gotta put the X-axis to 0, Z-axis as well. And now the Y-axis, we can zoom in or out. That's it. Also, one thing that I want you to see is that before we're gonna animate or duplicate this, that we have some weird geometry here. And this is not because of our geometry of the cylinder, right? Because you can see that there are way more edge loops that are actually not being used or utilized. This is actually because this Bezier curve is just not high poly enough. And you would think like, oh, I'm just gonna add a new subdivision surface in here. That does not work. you need to go into the object data properties and put the resolution preview higher. So let's do, I don't know, 64. Now you can see that it's nice and smooth. So let's now go into the animation tab, and here on the left we have our camera view, and here on the right we can start to edit and compose this whole animation. First of all, I want my studio to go down again, and now I can start editing this, right? So I can move this around, this one, and yeah, just move them to wherever you would like to. What I personally wanted to do here is I wanted to kind of create a multiple of these cool curves. So it curves backwards and in front and to the side, but also that it kind of ends up or starts at one part of the camera and goes towards the other one. So it's a nice line here. So something like this would actually be decent. And if you're happy with it, you can just duplicate them. So select them both, by the way. You cannot just only select one. Select them both, duplicate them, and then move them a little bit around here. And we can do it over and over, right? So I'm just going to duplicate them right now like this, just so we have a little bit of time save. But you can see that in my final kind of render, I had all of this here, right? It's just playing around with your Beziers, and that's it. Let's animate this. First of all, how long do we want this animation to take? I am just going to do 100 frames. Then at frame 0, I want these cylinders to be outside of the camera view. So G, X, and then move it around. So somewhere around here. Then I, and we only have to do the location. Then the last frame, G, X, all the way till it's outside of the camera view, I, location. Same for these ones. So frame 0 is going to be here, I, location. Frame 100 is going to be here, I, location. Now, let's look at our rendered viewport inside the camera view, and here we have it. So I would highly suggest you also play around with some of the lighting, because we created a cool material, right? We created an awesome plastic material, but if you don't have nice reflections, then it will still look like shit. So grab your lights, play around with them. So this one maybe goes here, right? And then we already get some strikes on here. You can make this light bigger and more powerful. You can also, of course, go back to the shading and then use nodes in here, so we can kind of play around with the power inside this emission node, right? So here you can see that we get these nice lines, and I think I used like 2 or 3 of these lights, and of course in combination with the HDRI. So that is everything that you need to know to create this cool animation. I hope you guys learned from it. If you like it, please like and subscribe. It will help me a lot. And yeah, any other information that you need to know is in the description down below. So I see you guys in the next video. Bye bye.